box and whisker plots. No, not line or dots, box and whisker plots. That's what we're gonna learn today. So this is how I envision that the naming of box and whisker plots came to be. People were sitting in a room and they were like, what do you see on this graph? And somebody was like, hey, I see some boxes. And then somebody else was like, I see some things that kind of look like whiskers. And they were like, let's call it a box and whisker plot. Brilliant. So what a box and whisker plot does is it takes our whole data set and it breaks it down into 4 different sections. Each one is called a quartile. Quartile meaning 4 parts. Think quarters, there's 4 quarters in a dollar, there's 4 quarters in a football game. Quart means 4, so quartile means 4 sections. You guys are welcome to do this activity at your house if you want. All you need is a piece of paper, and then you need to fairly evenly write out this data set across the whole paper. Okay, you'd want 18, 51, 53, 66, 70, 87, 87, and 100 written out across your paper. Some of you might have noticed this, but you might be looking at this and be like, oh my gosh, Mrs. Lucas, you put these in order from least to greatest for us. Thank you. And you would be right. Now, some of you also probably didn't notice, but if you didn't notice, now pay attention to it. Yes, these numbers are in order from least to greatest, which is good. They have to be in order from least to greatest before this will work. So now that I have my data set ordered from least to greatest, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this paper directly in half this way. Making sure it's nice and crisp. Paper cut out. Ta-da! Okay, so what this crease is telling me is I am saying that this is halfway through my data set. So the only problem is that this line is between the numbers 66 and 70. Well, we want to figure out what number is directly between 66 and 70. That way I know what number this line is actually on. So what number is between 66 and 70? Directly in the middle, the number would be 68. 68 is directly between 66 and 70. Thinking back to our vocabulary that we already know, that means that 68 is our median of this data set. So what we just found was the median of our data set, 68. Go ahead and label the median in your math notebook, but while you're labeling that, I'm going to keep talking. But pay attention to the picture below. That's going to help you know how to label the median. What's nice about a median and what's nice about the box and whisker plot is that means that from the median, 50% of my data is on this side of the median and 50% of my data is on this side of the median. So it's a really nice way to see how spread apart the bottom half of your data is and the top half of your data. Remember, half of your data is the same thing as 50%. Mrs. Lucas, I would like to point out that you said that we were going to separate the data into 4 parts and that's only 2 parts. Very nice observation. We're going to get to 4 parts right now. So what we're going to do is now we're going to take our lower half of our data and I'm going to fold that just to the median. Da-da-da, ta-da! All right, but once again, we have 2 numbers that are here. So what number is directly between 51 and 53? 52, 52. So 52 is directly between 51 and 53. So what that means is that 52 is this new vocabulary word called a lower quartile, or sometimes referred to as quartile 1. So 52 is our lower quartile or quartile 1. Make sure you label that on your box and whisker plot in your math notebook. Sorry to interrupt our teaching, but I did have to tell you that if you hear weird noises, just look at what I'm dealing with. This is the weather outside. It is howling, okay? So now we're gonna finally get to the 4th part of our data set. So here's my upper half. I'm going to go ahead and fold the upper half now to the median. Once again, ta-da! And now I see, well, whatever line this is called has to be between 87 and 87. Well, what number is directly between 87 and 87? 87, that's right, 87. Oh yeah. So that means that 87 is what we are going to call the upper quartile. So 52 was our lower quartile. 87 is called the upper quartile, or sometimes referred to as Q3, quartile 3. So quartile 1, the median is called quartile 2 sometimes, and then the upper quartile is called quartile 3. So let's take a minute. We talked about how 50% of the data was on either side of the median, but now let's talk about how much data is in each one of these quartiles. So each one of these quartiles, remember we said quartile means four parts. So each one of these quartiles should have a fourth of our data. Well, what's 1/4 as a percent? 25%. So here are two numbers. That means that these two numbers are 25% of my data. Then if I look at quartile 2, these two numbers are 1/4 of my data. And then between the median and quartile 3 is two numbers. That means another 1/4 of our data, or 25% of our data. And then between the third quartile, or the upper quartile, and maximum over here is, once again, two numbers, or 1/4 of our data, or 25% of our data. So each one of these quartiles represents a fourth, or 1/4, or 25% of our data. Quartile. 4 parts, 4 sections. So the last two vocabulary words that we need to talk about are the minimum and the maximum, which you already know these words, you're familiar with them. So I'm just gonna go ahead and circle my minimum and my maximum in my data set. However, from the picture below, you'll see that minimum is the same thing as the lower extreme, and maximum is the same thing as the upper extreme. So minimum and lower extreme and maximum and upper extreme are interchangeable. So my minimum is 18, and my maximum is 100. Those are the last two pieces of information that you need to know about box and whisker plots and the vocabulary. So lower quartile, median, upper quartile, minimum, maximum. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is something called inner quartile range. So if I'm looking here, and I know that this is quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, that means that my inner quartile is this inner section of the graph, And we already know what range means. Range means distance between two things. So if I want to find the inner quartile range, that means that I want to find the range between 87 and 52. I want to find the range between my upper quartile and my lower quartile. So to find the inner quartile range, we are going to do the upper quartile minus the lower quartile. And remember, the upper quartile is sometimes called Q3. So I'm going to do Q3 minus Q1. 87 minus 52, which equals, well, what does that equal? That equals 35. So I would say 35 is my inner quartile range, which is sometimes abbreviated as IQR, inner quartile range. Inter meaning the inside, quartiles meaning there's 4 parts, right? So the inner sections, and then range meaning the distance between 2 points. So make sure you filled in your math notebook anytime you saw a picture pop up with that vocabulary. Get really familiar with it. Let me know if you have any questions at all, or Mrs. Williams or any other of the teachers in the building. And you guys are doing an awesome job. We miss you. We love you. Goodbye.